Imagine a damp August morning in the year 1943. Deep within occupied France, on a remote Luftwaffe airfield, the air is thick with the smell of aviation fuel and the nervous tension of war. A prize has just fallen from the sky, a trophy delivered not by victory, but by chance. An American Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, its massive frame largely intact, sits silently on the tarmac. To the German fighter pilots, who had only ever seen it as a fleeting, formidable shadow in the stratosphere, it was an object of grim curiosity. They had nicknamed it the Fliegende Flasche, the flying milk bottle, a crude term for its thick, ungainly fuselage. It seemed to defy the very principles of elegant aerial design that they held so dear. But for the technical officers and engineers, this was no laughing matter. This was a chance to dissect a legend, to peel back the aluminum skin of a ghost that had been haunting their high-altitude formations. For months, reports had filtered back from the front lines describing this American brute, a fighter that could absorb astonishing punishment and still fly, a fighter that seemed to breathe a different air in the thin, cold heights where their own best aircraft began to struggle. The story that has echoed through the decades often centers on a lead engineer, a man of science and numbers, who was tasked with uncovering the secrets of this captured machine. As he and his team began their methodical examination, they believed they were cataloguing the strengths and weaknesses of an enemy weapon. They did not realize they were, in fact, reading a prophecy written in steel, a mathematical proof that Germany was already losing a far larger war, a war of factories, of resources, and of industrial philosophy. This is not merely a story about a single airplane. It is the story of a technological and industrial awakening that would change the world. We will move beyond the simple anecdotes to explore the hard engineering truths that lay within the P-47's design. We will dissect the very heart of the machine, the magnificent Pratt Whitney R-2800 engine, and its revolutionary turbo-supercharger system. We will understand precisely why this technology represented a chasm that German industry, brilliant as it was, could not cross in the heat of total war. And finally, we will confront the soul-crushing numbers, the sheer scale of production that turned this single airplane from a curiosity into an unstoppable avalanche. This is the story of how an ugly, overweight fighter became a symbol of a nation's unassailable power, and how the engineers who first examined it saw the future of the war written in its very rivets. To truly appreciate the shock that the P-47 delivered, we must first understand the world of aerial combat it entered. The German Luftwaffe had achieved a state of near-mythical dominance in the early years of the war, built upon a foundation of superior tactics and two exceptional fighter aircraft, the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf W-190. These were not just machines, they were expressions of a distinct German engineering philosophy. The Bf-109 was the quintessential interceptor, a rapier in the sky. Its heart was a liquid-cooled, inverted V12 engine, most famously the Daimler-Benz DB605. This engine configuration allowed for an incredibly narrow and aerodynamic fuselage, granting the aircraft superb speed and a nimble response. It was a thoroughbred, designed for speed and agility above all else. But like all thoroughbreds, it had a delicate constitution. Its elegance was also its vulnerability. The entire engine depended on a complex network of pipes and radiators filled with coolant. A single well-placed bullet, one shard of shrapnel piercing that fragile circulatory system, could be a death sentence. A pilot might watch in horror as his engine temperature gauge spiked into the red, knowing he had only minutes, perhaps seconds, before his magnificent engine seized, turning his fighter into a multi-ton glider. In contrast, the Focke-Wulf Fall 190 represented a different, more robust philosophy. Its designer, Kurt Tank, had placed his faith in the raw power and durability of an air-cooled radial engine, the BMW 801. A radial engine, with its cylinders arranged in a circle around a central crankshaft, presented a much larger frontal area, creating more drag. But what it lost in aerodynamic purity, it gained in sheer toughness. Cooled by the rush of oncoming air rather than a fragile liquid system, the BMW 801 could absorb an incredible amount of damage. Stories abound of 4 190s returning to base, with entire cylinders shot away, the engine still chugging along, valiantly pulling the pilot home. It was a warhorse, strong and dependable, a perfect complement to the Bf-109's Rapier. These two aircraft, born from opposing design principles, formed the formidable backbone of the German fighter command. They were the product of a highly skilled, almost artisanal approach to aircraft manufacturing. Then came the Thunderbolt. As the German engineers began their work, their first task was to unveil its heart. The massive cowling was unbolted and carefully lifted away, and the men who had spent their lives working on the intricate but comparatively small German engines simply stood in a moment of stunned silence. Before them lay the Pratt Whitney R-2800 double Wasp. It was not merely an engine, it was a statement of industrial might. It was a radial engine, yes, but on a scale they had rarely encountered. 18 cylinders, arranged in 2 rows of 9, one behind the other, gave it a staggering displacement of over 46 litres. The sheer size was imposing, but it was the quality that truly silenced them. Every surface was machined to a flawless finish. Every component seemed to speak of a manufacturing process unburdened by compromise. In an era when German industry was increasingly forced to make concessions, to use lower-grade materials, to simplify designs to save time and resources, this American engine showed no such weaknesses. It was built with high-grade aluminum alloys, precision-forged steel, and a level of uniformity that suggested a mastery of mass production they had not thought possible. Their initial calculations were chilling. The engine's basic design indicated a power output of at least 2,000 horsepower, a full 300 more than their own superb BMW 801 at its peak. This was not a small incremental advantage. It was a generational leap in raw power. And this was before they even considered the intricate system of ducting that snaked away from the engine, a system that held the true secret to the P-47's dominance. The R-2800 was a masterpiece of metallurgy and mechanics, but it was the system that fed it, the complex respiratory system that allowed it to perform in the heavens, that would turn their professional admiration into a cold, creeping dread. They were not just looking at a better engine, they were looking at a fundamentally different level of technological capability, a capability they quickly realized they could not hope to match. The central challenge of high-altitude flight is the air itself. As an aircraft climbs, the atmosphere becomes less dense. For a piston engine, which relies on mixing air with fuel to create combustion, this thin air is a form of slow starvation. The engine is deprived of the oxygen it needs to burn fuel efficiently, and its power output plummets dramatically. To combat this, engineers on all sides developed a solution known as forced induction. The principle is simple. If the air outside is too thin, you use a pump to compress it, forcing more oxygen into the engine's cylinders than it could draw in naturally. This pump is known as a supercharger. Both German and American aircraft used this fundamental technology, but their chosen methods of powering it represented a critical divergence in engineering and industrial capacity. The German approach, refined to a state of art in the Bf-109 and Bf-190, was the mechanically driven supercharger. This device was directly connected to the engine's crankshaft through a series of complex and precise gears. As the engine spun, it also spun the supercharger's impeller, which in turn compressed the air. It was a reliable and effective system, a marvel of mechanical engineering. However, it had an inherent and unavoidable flaw. It was a parasitic system. In order to power the supercharger, the engine had to sacrifice a portion of its own horsepower. This theft of power grew more significant as the aircraft climbed higher, and the supercharger had to work harder to compress the ever-thinning air. At extreme altitudes, a significant fraction of the engine's total energy output was being consumed just to keep the supercharger running. The German fighters were, in essence, fighting against themselves as much as they were fighting the enemy, their performance ceiling limited by this law of diminishing returns. The American engineers at Republic Aviation, building upon pioneering work by General Electric, chose a far more complex, ambitious, and ultimately revolutionary path for the P-47, the turbo-supercharger. The German engineers examining the captured Thunderbolt followed the massive pipes leading from the engine's exhaust collectors. These were not simple exhaust stacks. They were carefully engineered ducts, made from specialized steel alloys, designed to channel the searing hot exhaust gases from all 18 cylinders into a single, roaring torrent. This torrent was directed towards the rear of the aircraft, not to be wasted, but to be harnessed. There, deep within the fuselage, lay the heart of the system, a small, incredibly robust turbine wheel. The blast of hot gas, traveling at nearly the speed of sound, struck the blades of this turbine, spinning it at speeds that were almost incomprehensible, often exceeding 20,000 revolutions per minute. This turbine was connected by a shaft to another wheel, the compressor, located at the front of the system. It was this compressor that did the work, scooping up the thin, cold outside air and compressing it to sea-level density, or even greater. This compressed air, now heated by the process, was then routed all the way back up the length of the fuselage, through a critical component called an intercooler, essentially a radiator that cooled the air charge before it was finally fed into the engine's carburetor. The result was that the R-2800 engine, even at 30,000 feet, believed it was breathing the thick, rich air of sea level. The elegance of the turbo-supercharger was that it was not parasitic. It was a recycling system. It took the immense energy of the engine's waste gases, energy that would otherwise be thrown away, and used it to generate power. The engine did not have to sacrifice its own output to run the system. It was powered by its own byproduct. This fundamental difference meant that while the German fighters saw their effective power decrease with altitude, the P-47's power remained constant, or in some cases even increased, all the way up to its critical altitude. For the German engineers, this system was both a marvel and a nightmare. They were familiar with the theory of turbocharging. They had experimented with it themselves. But they had always run into insurmountable obstacles that the Americans had apparently solved, and more terrifyingly, had solved on an industrial scale. The first problem was metallurgy. The turbine wheel and the exhaust ducts had to withstand constant temperatures approaching 1,000 degrees Celsius, a cherry-red heat that would cause ordinary steel to soften and fail. This required advanced alloys rich in nickel and chromium, strategic materials that were in desperately short supply within the Third Reich. The Americans, with their global access to resources, seemingly had no such constraints. The second problem was manufacturing. The turbine itself had to be balanced with microscopic precision to withstand its colossal rotational speeds. The entire system of ducts, controls, and intercoolers required thousands of man-hours of skilled labor to build and install. It was a complex, heavy, and expensive system. German industry, already strained to its breaking point and under constant Allied bombing, simply lacked the capacity to produce such a sophisticated system in the numbers required for a frontline fighter. The P-47's turbo-supercharger was not just a clever piece of engineering. It was a testament to a nation's ability to overcome immense technical challenges through sheer industrial and material wealth. It was a weapon that Germany could understand, could even admire, but could not replicate. The revelation of the P-47's technological heart was profound, but it was only the first layer of a much deeper, more disturbing truth. An advanced engine, no matter how powerful, is only as effective as the industrial base that produces it. As the German technical team compiled their findings, they began to request intelligence data on American production capacity. What they received in return was not just data, it was a death warrant for their nation's war effort. The numbers were so vast, so far beyond their own reality, that they seemed like a form of enemy propaganda. But the cold, hard evidence of the aircraft sitting on their own tarmac proved that the numbers were real. They learned that Republic Aviation was not crafting these fighters in small batches. They were pouring out of a factory in Farmingdale, New York, and later Evansville, Indiana, at a rate that defied German comprehension. By late 1943, production was exceeding 500 aircraft per month. Plans were already in motion to increase that rate to 700, even 800 per month in the following year. To put this into perspective, the entire German aircraft industry, across all manufacturers and all types, was struggling to produce a total of 300 to 400 single-engine fighters per month. America was producing more of this single advanced type of fighter than Germany could produce of all its fighters combined. And then came the data on the engine itself, the magnificent R-2800, The figure was so staggering it had to be rechecked for errors. Over the course of the war, more than 125,000 of these 2,000-plus horsepower engines would be built. This single engine type, used not only in the P-47 but also in legendary aircraft like the F-6F Hellcat and the 4U Corsair, was produced in numbers that dwarfed Germany's entire engine output. Giants of the American automotive industry, like Ford and Chevrolet, had seamlessly converted their mastery of mass-producing car engines to the far more complex task of building aircraft power plants. The same industrial logic that had put a car in every American driveway was now being applied to putting a fighter plane in every corner of the sky. This numerical disparity was a blow, but the reality was even worse when one considered the nature of the products themselves. American aircraft were, on average, larger, heavier, and more complex than their German counterparts. A single B-17 Flying Fortress bomber, for instance, required more aluminum, more man-hours, and more sophisticated systems than 3 Bf-109 fighters. And the Americans were building thousands upon thousands of these heavy bombers. The material disparity was overwhelming. The German engineer, trained to think in terms of efficiency and conservation, of squeezing the maximum performance from the minimum resources, was now confronted with a design philosophy born of immense, seemingly infinite abundance. The P-47 itself was the perfect embodiment of this. Examining the airframe, the engineers noted its incredible ruggedness. It was built like a tank. The aluminum skin was of a heavy gauge. The internal framing was robust. The cockpit was encased in thick steel armor plating. The windscreen was armored glass far thicker than anything used in German fighters. The massive radial engine itself acted as an enormous shield for the pilot. This all added weight, a cardinal sin in traditional fighter design. German designers were obsessed with shedding every possible ounce to improve agility and climb rate. The P-47's designers, however, could afford the luxury of weight because they had an engine powerful enough to overcome it. Their design philosophy was not about elegance, but about survivability. They could build a fighter that could take a beating and keep on flying, confident that the sheer brute force of the R-2800 engine would handle the rest. This philosophy extended to its armament. When the engineers inspected the wings, they found not 2, not 4, but 8 Browning M2 50-caliber machine guns, each supplied with hundreds of rounds of ammunition. The combined rate of fire was over 100 rounds per second. A German pilot might have 60 rounds for his cannon and a few hundred for his machine guns, enough for a handful of brief, precise firing passes. The P-47 pilot could hold down the trigger and unleash a devastating wall of lead, shredding anything in its path. It didn't need to be a rapier. It was a sledgehammer. Every aspect of the aircraft, from its powerful engine, to its durable frame, to its overwhelming firepower, spoke of a nation that was not just fighting a war, but was burying its enemy under an avalanche of steel. The final report written by these engineers was a stark and dangerous document. It concluded that the P-47 represented a level of industrial and technological sophistication that Germany could not match, and that continued attrition against such a foe would lead to unsustainable losses. The report was submitted up the chain of command, where it was quietly filed away, dismissed by a leadership that refused to allow the inconvenient truths of mathematics to interfere with their ideology of will. In any honest assessment of aerial warfare, it is crucial to maintain perspective and acknowledge the complexities of the conflict. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a phenomenal aircraft, a game-changer in high-altitude combat and ground attack, but it was not without its rivals or its limitations. Its emergence did not occur in a vacuum, and its story is interwoven with that of another legendary American fighter, the North American P-51 Mustang. While the Thunderbolt was the rugged sledgehammer, the Mustang was the finely honed sword. Powered by the British-designed Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, mass-produced under license in America by Packard, the P-51 possessed an aerodynamic grace and, crucially, a phenomenal range that the thirsty P-47 initially lacked. With the addition of drop tanks, the Mustang could escort the heavy bombers all the way to Berlin and back, a feat that defined the air war in 1944. Debates continue to this day in hangars and online forums about which was the superior aircraft, but such debates often miss the larger point. They were different tools for different, though sometimes overlapping, jobs. The P-47 cleared the skies at high altitude and devastated targets on the ground. The P-51 protected the bomber streams deep in enemy territory. Together, they formed a devastating 1-2 punch that the Luftwaffe simply could not withstand. Furthermore, it would be a grave error to dismiss the continued ingenuity of German engineers, even under the most desperate of circumstances. As Allied piston-engine fighters achieved dominance, Germany unleashed a weapon that seemed to come from the future, the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. To a pilot in a Thunderbolt or a Mustang, the sight of an Me-262 flashing past, hundreds of miles per hour faster, with no visible propeller, must have been a deeply unsettling experience. The jet was a quantum leap in performance, armed with devastating 30mm cannons that could shatter a bomber with just a few hits. It represented a genuine technological superiority that briefly gave the Germans an edge in combat. So why did this wonder weapon not change the outcome of the war? The answer, once again, lies not in the brilliance of the design, but in the grim reality of the industrial war. The Me-262 was a magnificent concept plagued by the very shortages and production issues that the P-47's existence had highlighted. Its advanced Jumo 004 jet engines were notoriously unreliable. Built with lower-grade alloys as strategic materials ran out, they had a service life of perhaps only 10 to 25 hours before needing a complete overhaul or replacement. They were prone to flaming out or even catching fire if the pilot handled the throttle too aggressively. Moreover, Germany could only manage to produce them in relatively small numbers, a little over 1,400 in total. They arrived too late and in too few numbers to have a strategic impact. The Me-262 was a flash of genius in the twilight of the Third Reich, a testament to what their engineers could achieve. But like a single, brilliant general against an army of millions, it was ultimately overwhelmed by the sheer, grinding weight of numbers. It was another hard lesson that a technological advantage is meaningless without the industrial capacity to produce it, field it, and sustain it in combat. And so, we return to that airfield in France, to the quiet contemplation of the German engineers standing before the captured American fighter. The story of their discovery, whether it centered on one man or a team of experts, has become a powerful parable of modern conflict. What they saw in the P-47 was more than just an airplane. They saw a complete system, a vertically integrated chain of overwhelming power. They saw the vast iron ore ranges of Minnesota, the sprawling aluminum smelters of the Pacific Northwest, powered by immense hydroelectric dams, the roaring steel mills of Pittsburgh, and the impossibly vast assembly lines of Detroit. They saw the endless oil fields of Texas and Oklahoma, producing the high-octane fuel that was the lifeblood of Allied air power. They saw a nation fighting a war on two fronts, supplying its allies across the globe, and yet still capable of outproducing its enemies in every meaningful category. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not beautiful. It was not nimble. It was not the most advanced aircraft in the sky by the war's end, but it was the perfect weapon for the nation that built it. It was rugged, dependable, massively powerful, and could be produced on a scale that beggared belief. It perfectly embodied the American approach to war, solving problems not with delicate finesse, but with the application of overwhelming, irresistible force. The final tally is a testament to this reality. Over 15,600 Thunderbolts were built. They served in every theater of the war, destroying thousands of enemy aircraft, tens of thousands of trucks and trains, and countless ground targets. They were a cornerstone of the Allied victory. The ultimate lesson that echoed from the analysis of that captured machine was a simple and brutal one. The Nazi regime was built upon an ideology that willpower and tactical brilliance could overcome any material disadvantage. They believed that spirit could triumph over substance. The P-47 Thunderbolt was the loud, roaring, 8-gun refutation of that entire worldview. It was a declaration that in the 20th century, wars were won by nations with more oil, more aluminum, more steel, and more industrial capacity. It proved that ideology could not defeat mathematics. The engineers who saw it first understood this truth. They had looked into the heart of a machine, and in its precision, its power, and its sheer abundance, they saw the inevitable shape of their own defeat.